Welcome to Dialogues in African and African American History. This is Adjoa Cheryl Sterling, and today we are interviewing Professor Edward Scobie, a noted African Studies scholar. We will be discussing the African slave trade in our conversation today. I'd like to welcome Professor Scobie to our show. Welcome, Professor Scobie.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
Mm-hmm. Professor Scobie, before we actually launch into the discussion on the slave trade, I'd like to start with an overview of the European and African interaction.
Long before the slave trade, long before the sort of first 500 years, beginning with Columbus and the other navigators of the period, there had been contact between Europe and Africa. In fact, the very first contact was made through Africa. It wasn't, Europeans did not sort of go navigate to Africa to find Africa. Africa had already been there, and all the history that came about at the time, earliest times, came about from Africa, from Ethiopia, Egypt, and North Africa, the rest of North Africa, all the way going through the Mediterranean. It was the contact, African contact. Africans left Africa and went to Europe, not as people who were going to take lands and colonize lands, but they went there and they stayed for centuries. In fact, the very first big migration one can talk about at that time would be the migration of the Moors from North Africa that went there about 711 AD and stayed in Spain and Portugal and went through the whole of Europe, bringing their knowledge, bringing their science, bringing everything. And in fact, were it not for the Moors, there would be the expansion of Europe would not have taken place at the time. It was the Moors that were distinctly responsible for spreading the science of navigation that caused Portugal, before Spain even, to be able to cross vast areas of the sea using the instruments that the Moors had perfected in first Portugal and then Spain. This is not very well known, or scholars don't come up, particularly European scholars, they don't bring that to the fore. But this is something that is very, very, very well known among scholars today, among African scholars today. And when we talk about the Moors, people like to think that the Moors, we're talking about people, Arabic people, but that's not so. Let me give you some definition of the Moors. One of the very first definitions that came about was by an African who was called Leo Africanus, and a book that he published first in Italian and then in English in 1600. That's going way back. This is how he describes the Moors. And I'm quoting him from his Geographical History of Africa. He says, "For all the Negroes or black Moors are descendants of Cush, the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. But whatever difference there is between the Negroes and the tawny Moors, it is a fact that they are all of the same ancestry, and that is African." There is no doubt about it. And others have gone further and described whom the Moors were. For instance, Chancellor Williams, in his book, he asks, who are the Moors? And then he answers his own question. He says, now again, just who are the Moors? The answer is very easy, and I'm quoting Chancellor Williams. The original Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. As amalgamation became more and more widespread, only the Berbers, Arabs, and Coloureds in the Moroccan territories were called Moors, while the darkest and black-skinned Africans were called black Amors. Eventually, black was dropped from blackamoor. In North Africa and Morocco, In particular, all Muslim Arabs, mixed breeds, and Berbers are readily regarded as Moors. The black Africans, having had even this name taken from them, must contend for recognition as Moors. And that is why there has been a lot of contention. There's no contention. The Moors were African peoples primarily. There was a certain amount of miscegenation with the Arabs and so on. And later on, they came into different colors, from black almost to near white, as we have in the world today, in the Western world today. You have African peoples that are of all different shades of color, going almost to white. So this is the kind of thing that happened when the Arabs conquered Africa. And another scholar, he's a great big Ghanaian scholar, Dr. De Graaf Johnson, and he wrote a book called African Glory, and he calls it the story of a vanished civilization. And here is what he says again, to use another scholar to be able to bring credence to what I'm telling you here. It was because the conquering army in Spain was largely made up of Africans from Morocco that we hear such phrases as the Moorish invasion of Spain, and why Shakespeare's hero Othello is a Moor, and why the word blackamoor exists in the English language, a word which leaves no doubt as to the color of the army of occupation in Spain and Portugal. In 711, the conquering army that took over Spain and Portugal were Africans, the Moors, and they remained there from 711 right up until 1492. That's almost 9 centuries they remained. And that is why Spain and Portugal and Italy and Sicily, the people there they have this kind of shades of color. I mean, I myself witnessed that when I visited Spain and when I visited Portugal. I was explaining, I've had some experiences of people who claim descendants of Moors, and they look like you and look like me. In fact, they were surprised to think that I would think that they were not, that they came there. Some people in Spain and Portugal, they come from Angola. Their parents and so on come from Angola. But there's a section in Portugal, for instance, that I visited a lot. And in Lisbon, the Moors used to call Lisbon Las Buna, and it's on top of the hill overlooking the city. And that's where most of the Moorish descendants are. And I took pictures of them, I wrote stories, and the Moorish, they look like you, they look like me, they look like BrotherRonn, and it didn't surprise me. All throughout Portugal, I was so taken aback with this kind of revelation that when I went back to England, I had gone there doing research. I wrote a story called Africa in Portugal. It amazed me so much how African Portugal was, and Spain the same thing. Not only the people, the kind of style of life, the ways of life, their habits, and the whole thing amazed me. And so, not only in Africa, the Moors invaded lots of Europe. They went as far up as the Hebrides in Scotland, in England, and they had colonies right up into the 10th century AD. They were colonies of Moors who conquered and who lived on those areas near the sea, both in going down to Wales, going down to Ireland. You find a lot of these people are darkish, they're dark-haired and they're swarthy-ish, all the way down to Devon and Cornwall in England, going all the way through France. In fact, up to now, there's an area in France, in southern France, called Petite Afrique. They still call it Petite Afrique because it was it was where the Moors settled in great numbers. And the people there, you see it. I mean, the people are like you and I. And I mean, the same thing in Italy, the same thing in Sicily. The Teutons and others that came down, they began to get mixed. I'm not saying that they're not Spanish people and Portuguese people who, with this mixture, who look like Scandinavians, that they're blue-eyed and blonde and so on. But the deep set, the people who really, the population is a vast numbers of people who are of Moorish descent, and they don't hide it. I had experiences myself in Lisbon that people who were Moors, and they didn't hide it. They were happy and proud to state that. So it's a fallacy to think that Portugal and Spain and these places are white in the sense of Anglo-Saxon or Celtic or what, because they're not. I mean, I had even an English friend. He had been a professor at Cambridge, and later on he became a producer with the British Broadcasting Corporation, where I worked for a while, and we were very friendly. And I can remember I used to joke with him. I would call him an Englishman. Dr. Tiller, you're an Englishman. He used to tell me, I'm not an Englishman, I'm a Cornishman. I used to tell him, well, what's the difference between Cornish? Cornwall is part of England. He said, when I tell you I'm a Cornishman, it means I'm telling you that I'm of Moorish descent. And I mean, there's some people who, when you go to, I have spent time in Cornwall and in Devon in the southern parts of England, and it didn't surprise me. There's some people that are darker than me. And one more story, I was saying a while ago, that I was friendly with a photographer who worked for Time magazine and Life magazine. And Dr. Zinram, he came from Austria. And I used to go into his studio in Baker Street, which was near the BBC where I used to work. And I passed in there one day. I always passed, we would chat and have beers and so on. So I'd go to his home and listen to his music. And one day I went in there, and there was in his studio, in his front room, there was a huge congregation of men there, sitting there. And so I came in, I called out to him. When I got up to him, and I said, hey man, it's your studio is full of people. What are they doing there? He said, they're doing there's an advertisement for the Daily Express magazine, the Lord Beaverbrook newspapers, and they're looking for someone to play the part of a Portuguese fisherman for one of the advertisements about fish in the paper. So I said, oh, it's interesting. He said, you can stay and watch this thing. So while I was with him, while they were interviewing, looking at these men and so on, which one they would take for thing, the men who were doing this thing, the guys, the managers or whatever you call them, the big shots, one said to me, you, to me. He said, are you here for an interview? I said, no. Dr. Zrim said, no, he's my friend. He said, look, come into this office with me. So I came in, and to cut a long story short, they chose me as a Portuguese fisherman. So I said, but why? He said, they're Portuguese people like you, the men people and so on. And so I appeared in the Daily Express, the big things of Edward Scobie, black as a Portuguese fisherman. I wanted to say that that it is the influence, not only the sort of physical and the physiognomy of the Portuguese and the Spanish that are in fact I'm sorry. It's not only the looks, but the ways of life and the things that the Moors left there, their science, their learning, their navigation. All of these things were responsible for navigators to be able to cross the seas. The teachers at the time in Portugal, in Cordova, in Spain, in the other areas, they were Moors who taught. I mean, for instance, the teacher of Prince Henry the Navigator, they call him Prince Henry the Navigator, but he was Abul Hokel. He was a Moor from Morocco. He was from Morocco, and he was one of the teachers who taught Prince Henry the Navigator all that he knew, the drawing of the compasses and so on. All these things came from the Moors. So what I'm saying, it is the Moors that brought science and civilization to Spain and Portugal. I mean, it's not anything that is doubted anymore. Even going before that, I was telling you, it was Europe that, in fact, bended on its knees to accept the civilization of African civilization, if we want to use it in a broad sense, not the other way around. Listen to what was said in A History of the Modern World by Dr. R.R. Palmer of Princeton University and Dr. Joel Carlton of Duke University. It is a book that was published by Alfred Knopf here some years ago. And it's a history book. And the very beginning of this history book, and the very first chapter, it says, ancient times, before the Greeks. And listen to the very first paragraph of that book. And these two scholars they're great American, white American scholars. One's from Duke University, it's a big university, and Princeton, I don't have to tell you anymore. This was a book that was, actually it was used up to about 10 or 12 years ago, but for some unknown reason, with the rise of Africanization in scholarship, they pulled it out. The history department used to use it. And this book says in the very, I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but let me read just a few sentences for you. Before the Greeks, Europeans were by no means the pioneers of human civilization. Half of man's recorded history had passed before anyone in Europe could read or write. The priests of Egypt began to keep written records between 4000 and 3000 BC. But more than 2,000 years later, the poems of Homer were still being circulated in the Greek city-states by word of mouth. Shortly after 3000 BC, while the pharaohs were building the first pyramids, Europeans were creating nothing more distinguished than huge garbage heaps. Ironically, like the pyramids, they still endure and are known to archaeologists as kitchen middens. I won't go further in this part, but this is European civilization is fifth down the line. There were many civilizations that predated that, and the main one was the civilization of Africa. And that is what the history of the world shows you. I mean, scholars, you can go into all sorts of scholars, even European scholars, you can go into that and you find that everywhere. I mean, going way back, way back, you find that the scholars in those early days and scholars today. This question of Egypt and civilization of Africa came about only when the breakup of Africa as it was and the meeting with Europeans, particularly in the 14th and the 15th century, when the meeting began to take place, and then Columbus began to go on his enterprise. This is when the whole thing began to break up, and they said the growth of the modern world began with Columbus. But by that time, they began to institute, it was the slave trade and slavery that broke the complete picture that it was presented. And that picture was the picture that they put in its place was a picture of Africans who were on the fringes of civilization. They lived a kind of seduced twilight life, not knowing about themselves, what they had done, who they were, and so on. And that is totally untrue. There is absolutely no scholarship in any book or so that can backfire, except the scholarship of men who are racist. And you find more of that. This happened, even scholars who are white scholars tell you that, the genuine ones, tell you that it came from the South by a bunch of racists who still today carry on the same kind of thing. There is not an iota of truth in whatever they tell you about these things. It's the same thing they talk about education. There's absolutely nothing at all about that. If you give somebody an inferior education and you shoot them and lynch them and beat them to take it, you will produce people who think inferior. But if all of us, Africans and others, are capable of great thought and great achievement, let nobody fool you. Racism cannot stop that. White supremacy could never stop that. And that is exactly what we're fighting at the turn of this century. All of these are vestiges of the slavery and the amalgamation and the meeting of Europe and Africa. What happened? Look, in 1492, the Moors eventually, when Spain began to join together, the kings and queen of Spain, began to join, Isabella and Ferdinand. That is when they managed to defeat the Moors and expel the Moors. And even so, what they left of the Moors, they couldn't destroy it. And they benefited by it. They talk about the Renaissance, the music, the art, the everything. Look at the buildings in Portugal. Fantastic. The Alhambra, and these were built by Africans. Fantastic. They had running water. They had hot and cold. They had conditioning. They had air. They had everything you could possibly want. You see those homes, those great things they talk about when you go and see the great architecture in Spain and in Portugal. The great the bull rings they have, the Casa del Toros they have in Spain and Portugal. These things come from the Moors. It was the Moors that built them. It is not the Spanish people that came from, well, I don't want to say that because I don't want to sound in any kind of divisive way. But that's a fact. And these things are kept from me. Because you keep these things away, that does not mean that it isn't true. And they do it all the time. They do it here. It's a thing we know. I don't have to go into that. It's a thing that we all know. They hide things from you. They don't tell you the truth. And scholars expose it. Scholars who are really serious about their scholarship. Even the scholarship, even people like Bartholomew Las Casas, who was actually responsible for bringing after the Caribs and the Arawaks had been wiped out, and the Caribs that were not wiped out, those that remained, refused to be slaves. When he looked to Africa to get slaves, in the final, when Las Casas, the man who was close to Columbus, he found out Columbus was a cruel man. He began to have a hatred for Columbus. That Columbus wasn't as the great man that people thought. He exposed him in his writings. They didn't publish his work until very late after he died. One of the things he wrote in his will, this Franciscan priest, when he died, his paragraph in his will, his last will and testament, he was not blaming the Caribs and the Arawaks and the Africans. This is what he said in his will. At the end of a long life, Las Casas left us this somber prophecy and warning in his last will and testament. He said, these are the words of Las Casas in his will. You can read it in Spanish in anywhere. I believe that because of these impious, criminal, and ignominious acts perpetrated unjustly, tyrannously, and barbarously upon them, the Indians, God will visit his wrath and his ire upon Spain for her share, great or small, in the blood-stained riches obtained by theft and usurpation, accompanied by such slaughter and annihilation of these people, unless Spain does much to ask for penance. This is the last will and testament of a man who played a great part in being responsible for Africans coming here when the Arabs, the Caribs, and the Arawaks had been wiped out, and the Caribs fought them tooth and nail and would no longer be enslaved. This is what he wrote in his last will and testament. So this is no person teaching, no scholar teaching at the universities, unless they're scholars who's after the truth. After knowledge, knowledge is a quest for the truth, will tell you that, and it's there for you to see and for you to read.
Now, Professor Scobie, in light of the Moorish invasion and, we should say, civilization of Europe, and the European response, specifically, with Spain and Portugal, we know that they were the first voyagers to Africa. What do you think was their motivation in traveling to the African continent? Do you think it was just adventure, or they were looking for, let's see, the riches that their conquerors had? Or do you think they had some, other motivation, some, maybe revenge motivation, because after all, they had been occupied for hundreds of years by these people?
No, they were in quest for gold. That's what they were in quest for. It was an enterprise. Columbus, if you read Columbus's log and what he said, he called his journey, he called it an enterprise. In Spanish, he wrote, it is an enterprise looking for gold. He didn't expect to reach where he reached there, but still, the journey was the same for the gold. That is what they wanted. Europe was land poor, starved, and it didn't have the gold that Africa had. They began to know through the Moors and others. They knew that there was gold in Africa. Columbus himself had traveled to Africa before he had been. He had been on a ship. He wasn't the captain of any ship, but he was on a ship, on a ship that went to travel to the west coast of Africa. And he had met Moors. He had met Africans who had sailed, and he had conversational contact with them, and they had told him about this thing. Most of the gold of the Moors and thing came from Africa. They knew this thing, and they knew this is where Spain, Portugal, Denmark, they all jumped into this thing to be able to get after the gold. And the first thing, that's why they came there as a lasting thing. They didn't come for any revenge. If they came for revenge, they would just come there, kill people, and run away. But they built forts all along the west coast of Africa, buildings that have lasted up to today. These buildings are there, the different slave forts. They wanted to get, that is where they were going to get, they wanted gold, they wanted ivory, and then they turned on to the human gold that they were getting, Africans that they were enslaved. That was the other gold that they had. So they were looking for gold itself. They were also looking for ivory, and then they had the people. When they began to have colonies in these countries, everywhere they went, it was after gold they were after. The Spanish came to the Caribbean. When they came there, the Spanish, they were looking for gold. Even Pizarro and the others that came there, Ponce de Leon, all of them came for gold. And the gold of the Indies, that was that built Spain up and made Spain and Portugal the countries that they were. Before any of the other countries in Europe, Spain and Portugal were well ahead in science, in education, in everything. The first universities in Granada, in Toledo, all these places had universities that had been set up not by Spanish, but by Moors. African Moors, Berbers, blacks, people who were black in color, black in complexion. These places were set, and they were tutored by these Africans. They were not tutored, as I say, by any Spanish, blonde Spanish at all, and gray-eyed Spanish. By Africans, they were tutored. Their whole education. And when they left, even their own scholars who write about Spain and Portugal at that period, they left, Spain went down. It became nothing almost, because there were only barbarians, thieves, footpads, vagrants who were around in Spain at the time. All the things that the Moors had left is one of the great scholars that wrote about Spain and Portugal. It's always good to quote, because when you quote, people know very well you're quoting one of them. You're not quoting necessarily only African scholars, but you're quoting their scholars, and they see for themselves what happened, what in fact happened. Let me just give you a short quotation that what this scholar said about Spain and Portugal. It's always good to have that kind of evidence with you, so you can bring it forth so people will understand very well what you're in. Oh yes, there it is. The man who made this statement was an Englishman, a writer who made this statement about what happened to Spain and Portugal. This writer was Lane Poole, that you probably, Stanley Lane Poole, the story of the Moors in Spain. And this man said here, how were the Moors compensated for their phenomenal contribution in civilizing Spain, Portugal, and other areas of Europe steeped in barbarism and darkness? The 19th century scholar Stanley Lane Poole paints a picture of European savagery of the lowest form in the genocide of the Moors. 50,000 of them were brutally murdered on the famous Day of All Saints in 1570, when the honor of the apostles and the martyrs of Christendom was celebrated by the virtual martyrdom of these Moors. No less than 3 million Moors were banished by the first decade of the 17th century. They were sent to Holland, they were sent to Rotterdam, Amsterdam, to Hamburg. That is where they were sent. They were sent eventually, they were sent to the Caribbean. And it says here that, to use the words of the Franciscan priest Las Casas during the Columbian era, he said that when they did that to the Moors, Moloch must have been in the skies. In other words, the devil must have been in the skies in Spain when they were doing that. Spain and Portugal did not escape retribution. Where once wit and learning flourished, a general stagnation and degradation had fallen on their people and lands. Historians are agreed that they deserve their humiliation. Such is the terrible price that Spain and Portugal had to pay for their treatment of the Moors. As Stanley Lane Poole had concluded in his work, he said, they did not understand that they had killed their golden goose, unquote. This is what Spain went down. As I said, they talk about the Renaissance up to now, the music of the Renaissance, the art of the Renaissance. It was the Moors that was responsible. After that, Spain, these countries died out. You can see for yourself what happened to Spain and Portugal, and these places became lesser kingdoms. The kingdoms that grew at the time were France for a while until the Louis died out and they were pushed out and they were executed during the French Revolution, and also in Britain. Britain is the last sort of remaining serious monarchy, and even so, you know, it is not on very good, strong legs at the moment due to the sort of things that are happening in the family, in the royal, quote-unquote, family. So, however, I'm saying all the things that were done, the questions of civilization, the questions of scholarship, the question of science, the question of inventing of things, the Moors were the ones, the inventing of almost everything that went to Spain and Portugal came from these Africans. The reverse was true when Europeans invaded Africa and brought and colonized the Caribbean and North America with African peoples. They came there for the quest of gold. There is a scholar who said, a Spanish scholar has said that the Spanish would, and I don't know what he means, but he said it in Spanish. Translated, he says, the Spanish would rape the sun to get gold. This is his saying. The Spanish would rape the sun for gold at the time. And that's all they came for gold. The gold of the Indies, the gold of Hispaniola, the gold of the mainland countries of the Americas. That's what they were there for, to bring back to Seville and to bring back to Madrid and Barcelona, to make Spain what it was. They built all of the great municipal buildings and great things you see. They all came out of the riches and of the African slave trade and African slavery. The same thing with France, the same thing with Denmark, the same thing when you go to France and in England, even the banking system in England, people responsible for that is the slave trade and what they did to slaves. The slaves they owned, they cut the amount of sugar cane that really caused the Industrial Revolution to grow. Were it not for the Industrial Revolution, Britain, and wait not for that, Britain would have been backward. All these countries would be backward. One of the great men, the great Englishman, he was the late Prime Minister of England, Sir Winston Churchill. He made a statement about talking about what the sugar meant and the Caribbean meant to Britain, and causing the Industrial Revolution to take place. Were it not for the sugar of these countries, Britain would have been backward, and the same thing would apply to France and to all the other countries. Today, when you look at the banks, if you go into, I was in Liverpool a few years ago, 2 years ago, I had gone to a conference in Liverpool. It was on the slave trade and slavery. And 12 of the main streets in Liverpool, in the commercial section of Liverpool, are named after men who profited from slavery and the slave, men who owned slaves, who owned plantations. All the banks, Midland banks, Barclays, all the banks there are by men who had begun on the slavery and the slave trade, and men who sold slaves and who got compensation when there was emancipation. And they started these banks. Most of these great big names today, their descendants, the Westminster Bank, all these things come from men who own plantations in the Caribbean. And so what I'm saying is that but for these men, But for at the time, Britain and these countries would have been backward. And the hurtful thing about it is that the Caribbean and Africa never profited. Africa was as much involved in this thing as we were as the Africans that were sent to the Caribbean. Because while Africans were being enslaved and taken to the Caribbean and to the rest of the Americas, there were also missionaries who were taking lands and carving out every bit of land in Africa for Europeans. If you look at a map of Africa in the 1930s, you know what you're going to see? German East Africa, French West Africa, British West Africa. Why should there be British and German and Dutch West and West Africa? Why should that be? It shows you that these were the names of the conquerors who went there and conquered these places. And what do you think they conquered? Up to today, there is racism and there's white supremacy. They didn't go to Africa because they loved Africans. They went to Africa for the riches and the lands. They are still going there for the same purpose. The only people that don't seem to like Africa are Africans themselves in the Caribbean and in North America. Not everyone, but we're the only ones that don't seem to want to claim Africa as our ancestral home. And it's a sad thing.
Professor Scobie, we've covered a whole lot of different areas, but I want to be very specific with certain things for our viewers. How did we were first talking about the Europeans and their quest for gold. This is why they came to Africa.
Yeah.
And of course, we know, supposedly in history, Columbus discovered America in 1492. And then they went to the New World and they started to establish the colonies. And from there, we began the slave trade. But I want to talk about the motivation behind the slave trade in depth. Okay, we know it was the whole idea of wealth and prosperity. But why didn't they just rape the New World, I should say? Why didn't they just take everything and leave? What made them decide to stay? This is a viable place. And what motivated them later on to establish colonies and set up new establishments and societies there?
I think I touched very briefly on why. For instance, they had a very hard time after Columbus and all the way through Ponce de Leon and Bilbao and all of them. They had a rough time with the Caribs, the Taínos, and the Arawaks. They fought them for centuries. In fact, they met millions of Arawaks and Taínos and others. And by the time 1660 came, by the time they had conquered Jamaica, the Caribs were only a matter of hundreds of thousands left. And the Arawaks were, by the 17th century, were almost totally wiped out. They would not do what the conquistadors wanted them to do. They would not seek for gold, they would not work in the mines, and they refused. And so the man who did that was Las Casas, who really said, well, look, they set about getting Africans to come. They couldn't bring Europeans here because they had tried indentured labor with Europeans who could not stand the intense climates in the Caribbean, who could not stand the intense climates here in the South, in Virginia, in Georgia, and these places. They got dysentery, they got malaria, they died, and so they were indentured. That is why Dr. Eric Williams said that slavery had three different colors at one time. It was white, it was red, and it was black. Africans were the ones that, in fact, were the ones that could withstand because they had led an outdoor life. They were farmers, they were planters, they were fishermen. They had led this kind of life, the life that was necessary to get to the Caribbean. It's not only that the Spanish didn't want to stay in the Caribbean initially, but when the British and the French and the Dutch began to come out here at that same time and saw what was happening, They wanted to remain. They wanted to cause colonies because Britain was an island. Britain is a set of, the British Isles are a set of islands, offshore islands of Europe, with absolutely nothing there. So to come out there, to come out to these places, take Africans as well. The British first began to, on a contract, to sell slaves to Spain under the Asiento. They began to do that. And one of the great slave traders for the British at the time was the great Sir John Hawkins. And Sir John Hawkins had been given a title by Queen Elizabeth, and he was a great man who was leading the slave trade at the time. He was taking slaves and selling them to Spain in the Caribbean. But Britain itself saw the value, so they began to get into this thing themselves. The same thing that the Dutch began to do, the same thing that the French began to do. Everybody began to enter. By 1640, they had all entered into the slave trade, and slavery was a selling thing. And unfortunately, there was not all the nations of the world at the time were engaged in one trade, and they were in the trade of slavery, the slave trade and slavery. They were all engaged in that. Unfortunately, there were some African pundits, potentates, who got involved themselves, but they were not the beginners of that thing, but at a period of time, they were stopped by the chiefs themselves. They began to stop them from entering, and when they themselves saw the kind of horrible treatment that Africans were getting, their people were getting, they cut out of that. They stopped that because a few of the sons of chiefs and so on got caught. All Africans to Europeans, as they like to say, look alike. So they captured some of them. They captured some chiefs themselves. King Jajavo Popo was one that was enslaved, and they didn't like it, the conditions. That is why you see the drama of the Elizabethan period, the period of Queen Elizabeth and the period of Shakespeare. You find a lot of drama written at the time. The plays that were written were about rebellions, runaways, slaves that were fighting slavery. They were, all of them, and chiefs who were involved in this thing. A lot of the drama that was being shown in the West End of England, of London at the time, everywhere. This country was way back in drama, so we won't even count America at the time. But in England, where the drama, people would go to the drama and so on. And these are the things that we're going to see. These great epics of slaves who escaped, slaves who fought and who were leaders and so on. So they in turn, in the Caribbean, decided it was going to be a growing thing. And it was the money made out of sugar at that time, and also here, cotton. Is that money that began to build up the riches of Europe, and particularly Britain and France and countries like that, that made them be able to have this, what they call the Industrial Revolution. Britain began to get industrialized, commercialized. Things where they began to have machines. They began to have things. The whole age was changing from a sort of landed gentry age into a commercial age where steam engines and things were coming at the time, brought about by the wealth that they made from the slave trade and slavery. So it was a lasting thing. They didn't come there to they came there to stay. They looked upon these countries in a different way, in the Caribbean and so on. They looked upon these countries as merely places where they would have their slave plantations, they would transport and ship all their things back to Britain, back to France, and their home was in England and in France and so on. Not so here, because they began to send Europeans here, particularly at that time, Europeans who were felons, who had fallen foul of the law. The jails of England were overcrowded, were overburdened with English people in jail. So when they're talking about crime, I would wish that they would go into the statistics to show where crime came from, that the whole of the South, Virginia and Georgia, the Carolinas, were filled with felons who were taken from the jails of England and brought and settled there. So when people say they have a good, when I hear white people talking about crime and they have a good background and good ancestry, they better be very careful. They might have a great-great-grandfather who was a sodomist or something. They better be very careful about that, because lots of the people that were taken, they were taken from England and other places and Germany and so on to come to the Americas, particularly in the South, not to return. They were not allowed to return to England. Many of the felons were all branded like slaves were branded, and they had a mark. When you were a felon, you had a mark. You had a mark on your body, so they knew you were a felon. You could not go back to England. You had to stay here. So most of the people that came there had to stay in this country. So what I'm saying is, in the Caribbean, the same. They brought some felons and so on there. But you see, the thing that happened in the Caribbean, they had as much as twice or about 10 times as many Africans in the Caribbean as they had Europeans, because the Europeans did not look at the Caribbean as a place to build. They looked at the place, it was like a grand big factory where I would have my plantation, I'd have my townhouse, I would ship and transport this thing on the ships over to, I'd send them to Boston, to Salem, and to Newport News, and back to London, and back to Southampton, and back to Maine, and back to places, and Brussels and other places like that. So there were about, to every one European in the Caribbean at that time, there were 20 Africans. It was the ratio of the population was the exact opposite of the ratio here. So that is why you found in the Caribbean, and there were islands, most of the places were islands. That is why there were many, 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 many more successful slave revolts in the Caribbean than there were here. And the other thing too, slavery was slavery, but it had a different when I won't say complexion, but a different character to it. For instance, Africans who were enslaved by, say, the Spanish, they spoke Spanish, didn't they? Or they spoke a kind of Creole Spanish. So again, all the kind of way of life they had was part African and part the Spanish way of life. The Dutch was the same thing in the Dutch islands. The British were the same. The French, they all absorbed the sort of way of life that was imposed on them by the conqueror. In North America and the United States, when it became the United States, there was one conqueror. It was an Anglo-Saxon white conqueror from Britain, mainly. So the slavery had a more or less even and a similar sort of thing everywhere, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was in Alabama, whether it was in the Carolinas. But in the Caribbean, a slave coming from an island like Martinique that was French would have a different, he'd be a slave, he'd be an African, he was enslaved, but he'd speak a different language. For instance, he'd speak Creole, and that was a mixture of French and English, and some of the French and some of the African words he may still remember, whether they were Igbo words or whatever words, Wolof, but he would speak that in a new language that he was creating. On a British island, you had to speak the language of conquest was English. Same like the language of conquest in those French islands was French. So in other words, the Africans in different areas looked upon themselves in a different light, in the sense that I may be a slave, but and that is why you hear people talking about I'm French and I'm this and I'm that. It's because of the kind of experience they had during the slave conditions. Now these things are unraveling and they're not paying any attention to that as it should be. But that played a great part, because communication, the only way they could communicate with each other was through language. And when you did it through language, I mean, fancy you coming from Martinique and I'm coming from Antigua. I'm speaking English and you speaking a French Creole. If I don't understand the French Creole, we don't communicate. And this is one of the things that happened in the Caribbean. But there was one thing that was the same all over. The hatred of the slave master, the hatred of the slave condition, and all of them had the same sort of view, to escape from it. And it was easy, because the topography of the countries, Africans were more used to the topography of the rural topography. They knew what to do. They were the ones that knew where the places they could go and get away from. The English didn't know, the French didn't know, and the French were. That is why the French got such a terrible hiding in Haiti from the Africans that were there. It is not the troops, the Haitian troops, that beat the French. It was the people, the African people, of all 450,000 of them, that beat the French. Children were in the war, in that revolution. Women, grandmothers, everybody was in that war. Not only the soldiers who were fighting with Toussaint, Dessalines, but the people themselves, as a whole, fought in that war. And that's what defeated the French. Because you might have defeated an army in Abonite, in Haiti, in one section of Haiti. But if you went to a house and you asked for water, you didn't know if that water was poisoned. 10 to 1 the water was poisoned. And some nice granny would be giving you, here's the glass of water. But after you drank it, you wouldn't walk 2 steps. And so this is the kind of thing that happened. Our people fought, and the people could fight themselves. It wasn't a war only of soldiers. The British thought that, the French thought that, but it was the people that fought them. Over here, it was different. Africans were overpowered by a huge European plantocracy and population. And this, I'm not saying that they were not revolutions and revolts. There were recorded 250 revolts here. But they were more apt to succeed in the Caribbean where they did. They succeeded in many places, not only Haiti, many places. But the mistake that was made is that they never took, when they succeeded, they could have driven the French out, driven the English, and taken over the countries. Instead of that, they signed treaties and did business with them. That was the worst. The same thing happened in Brazil. The same thing happened with Zumbi. When they were very successful, they had some poor whites that came in and they were giving them, helping them and so on. And these were the ones that went and gave the news to the Portuguese and to the Brazilian troops and so on. And that's why the whole thing fell through. So, yes.
Oh, sorry. Can we cut for just a sec? Because what he just gave me, Dr. Scobie, you've been describing basically the whole philosophy of mercantilism and the triangular trade from Africa to America back to Europe. But I'd like to get into how this triangular trade advanced the European cause. It advanced their civilization. It advanced their power and their wealth. And conversely, how did it affect Africa? Because I would figure at one point in time when Africa and Europe first met, they were at an equal footing. And so now we see Africa at the lowest man on the totem pole. And this divergence occurred after the European and African connection. So could we address that for a moment?
Yes. It began to change in the 19th century. The conditions began to change. What was happening is that Europe at the conference, the Berlin Conference and the Brussels Conference in 1884, they began to partition off countries, sections of Africa for the different countries. 16 nations met in Berlin and in Brussels, and there was not one African. At that time, there were only a couple African countries that were really independent and free. Ethiopia was one of them. There were very few. At that time, they began to colonize. Not only they began to have armies and fight wars from those same slave forts that they built there. They began to have armies that were armies who remained there to fight different, what they called in those days, tribes. They began tribal warfare, and they began to partition off areas of the country. They not only stopped their trade, they began to have trade in palm oil, trade in precious metals, trade in oil, trade in everything. They began to commandeer this thing. And that is why the the wars that were fought, the Akan Wars were fought. Wars in Africa were not fought in a weekend or like the Gulf Wars. They were not fought for 4 years. These wars went on with the Zulus and others. These wars went on for years and years and years before they could conquer African countries. We must remember that. And they set out for that purpose because they are not only depending on sugar or tobacco, or just in their raw state, or cotton. They began with Industrial Revolution. They began to manufacture, and they began to control the countries and colonize those countries that they had done business with. They began to colonize, and they got chiefs and others, heads of different units, wafs and all of it, to join forces with them. They were selling the goods that they were making in North America, in the United States when it became the United States, in Europe, in France. They were selling these goods. For instance, a simple thing, all the gold that was coming out of Africa, they were selling to Africans who were the home of gold and silver and platinum and so on, the whole of chains and beads and so on. They were selling cheap beads and things that, from here to Africans. Cheap things were being sold to Africa. The other thing is that they began to change their clothing, their clothes. For instance, the cotton industry. Cotton began to be an industry where cotton fabrics were being produced on a vast scale, and lots of Europeans were using white cotton and other cottons. There was no synthetic cloths at the time. It was mainly cotton, and that was it, and so on, and silk. They were selling these cotton things to people in Africa, building up their trade and business in cotton and all other goods that they were making. They were utilizing the labor, cheap labor, to do that. At the same time that they were taking control, they had taken control of these countries, colonial control. They colonized these countries, and they brought in their soldiers, they brought in their government agents, they brought in their governments, their civil service. They did a whole big job. And in other words, that is why they said, British West Africa, if you wanted a passport to leave Nigeria, it was a British passport you would get that would say British West Africa if you wanted to go to England. And the other thing they did too, they were educating, there were lots of chiefs and so on who sent their sons. They were educating Africans, not only through missionaries in Africa, in the different colonies that they had built in Africa, but they were educating them in England, in France, in areas like that. And what they were doing with a lot of them, they were teaching them to be teachers and priests. Durham University, for instance, had a close contact with university in Sierra Leone. All these chief's sons would go to Germany, they'd go to France. A chief, for instance, like Nyambana, the chief in Sierra Leone, he had 3 sons. He sent one to England, one to France, and one to Germany. Asked why he did that, he said he did that because he wanted his sons to bring back a bit of the culture of all these 3 countries, so his own people in Sierra Leone would benefit by it. They had Durham University would take young Africans and turn them into priests in Durham University from Sierra Leone, from Ghana, the Gold Coast as they called it at the time, and they would go back there preaching the word of God through a Christian word of God through the Anglican Church or the Church of England or whatever church it was. They were doing that, and it was a complete takeover. They were not only taking over of the businesses, taking over of the natural resources, taking over of the finances to control it, and the mineral resources, but they were taking over of the minds of the people. Education in West and African countries, and education in the Caribbean was the same. For instance, the same exams and the same curriculum that they had in the grammar school in Dominica, where I came from, was the same curriculum they had at Oxford, Cambridge, London, wherever. And we were doing the same exams. Even that, I was going to the grammar school in the 30s, up into the late 30s when I was going to the grammar school. I knew everything about kings and queens and what they produced in Manchester and Liverpool and in the West Riding and in other. I knew everything about that, but I knew nothing. I would ask, well, what was happening in Dominica? What was happening in the Caribbean? What was happening? Was there only the wars by European countries fighting in the Caribbean Sea over the... I thought there was nothing happening. And that's in the 30s, the 1930s I'm talking about. And there are many, many, many people like me, many young boys and men and women today who went through that stage, and also in Nigeria. For instance, if I had a paper in Latin, for instance, I did Latin at school, a waste of time, but I did Latin. I had a paper in Latin, and I was going to do my senior school. I was going to do the upper school, which is the first part of the BA. I was going to do that, which I did. And what would happen? This December was the time of exams over there. You have it in May and June, but it's December. In Britain, they were having the exams in December. The same paper, same questions that I was being asked in Latin. English boys and girls at secondary school or grammar school, what you want to call them, were asked the same question. The ones in the Gold Coast were asked the same question. The ones in Nigeria were asked the same question. The ones in Sierra Leone. How they didn't identify those in the colonies, what they would do, they would give us index numbers. Where you came from, there was none. So I remember my index number was 7. And my name was given as 7, but the main paper, they knew who these people were. But when the examiners who were going to correct your papers got it, they didn't know if you were black, blue, pink, indigo, violet. It could have been an English paper, so they couldn't mark you in any way that you were a black person, you were a Caribbean, you were from the Caribbean. They didn't know that. You could be from Hartlepool in England or someplace. So they couldn't sort of be prejudiced with your paper. So that is what was happening at the time. All of us had this identical education that they were having in England. That is why the Caribbean and lots of people in Africa identified with the mother country. They identified closely with it. And the same thing with the French, with people like Césaire and Senghor, they identified with France. C'est la France, it was always la France. And the same thing with the British. I'm British to the core and that kind of nonsense we spoke about in those days. So consequently, colonization after slavery, the slave condition, made a total job of it. The entire economy was taken over. And goods were not developed and produced in Africa to feed and clothe Africans. They were produced in Europe, they were produced here. So the country had absolutely total dependence on the economy of Britain or the economy of France. They depended on France totally, like some countries still do. And that is why they are so developed and they sort of fell. They never could be themselves taking care of themselves and the economy and their infrastructure. Development always had to come from England or from France. I remember very well, after one big kind of, not a hurricane, but there was a lot of rain and a lot of things, and there was a sort of a drift and a lot of mud and things covered the road, and people couldn't pass. There were trees on the road. And so they asked some people who lived around there and who would have to go to their gardens there. They asked them, well, the government said, well, why don't you help to remove the stones and the mud and all that on the road? And they answered, as one person, they answered in Creole, but I'll tell you in English, they said, look, the road is not mine. The road belongs to the government. Let the government remove it. Every single thing depended on the British government or the French government or the Dutch government. And so it created a dependency. That is why up to today, those islands tell you they cannot feed themselves. They cannot clothe themselves. You hear my good friend Dr. John Henry Clark always saying, you can't even make a pin. We can't even produce, as it says, underclothes. You know, he's always saying that when he has his little talks. And it's true, we don't produce anything. And what we produce there is for sale to the very same people who colonized us. The economy we were allowed to be too dependent on Britain and France and the others. And that is why development went down. When the British left and they began to desert these places, they left them high and dry. Up to now, the governments have to be going abroad when anything happens to try to borrow money. That is why the countries, not only in the Caribbean, but in Africa, they're so much indebted to the World Bank and countries like that. They're so much indebted to them, with the result that they're not producing anything. The things that they have, their tourism and these things really don't matter, you know, to that extent. Because, you know, tourism can be affected by the hurricane as it was last year. So I'm saying that is why while Europe moved up through development and through technology and science and so on, the Caribbean and Africa went down. Only the resources of Africa that was used, particularly the mineral and other resources, the oil resources and so on, that has been beneficial. But in any case, who controls those resources? Look at it again. Holland, France, Russia, England, these people control oil, they control everything in Africa. The Caribbean is the same thing. The selling of lands, the giving of prime lands, all the big hotels that are in the tourist countries of the Caribbean are hotels that belong to the big combines here and in Europe. So the Caribbean peoples do not own anything. They are selling. What is happening as a result of this continual dependency brought about through colonialism? We have turned ourselves into a consumer people. We're consuming, but we're not producing. Everybody has to consume, but people are also producing. They talk about in the Caribbean still, and again, it's that kind of monoculture ideology that we have, that we depend on one crop. It's from the slave heritage. In the days of slavery, the crop that everybody used in the Caribbean was sugar. Every island produced sugar, and to a certain extent, a certain amount of indigo and rice and tobacco, but not to that great extent. The big money-making thing was sugar. Who was making the money? Not Caribbean people, European peoples. And today, look at the economy of the Caribbean. It comes strictly out of that monoculture. When you talk about the Caribbean, two things come to your mind. Tourism in some of the countries that have the topography and the right kind of seas and beaches and so on for tourism. What's the next thing you hear? Bananas, right? All of them are producing bananas. And who are they selling the bananas to? The same huge combines, industrial combines that own these things during the slave period, and their descendants, they're selling to them. The bananas that remain in the Caribbean are what they call rejects. They're not good enough. The quality and the standard is not good enough to sell in Europe or to sell in New York and so on. So they sell it to the people. So actually, we are a people eating the rejects of the food that we sell. We're eating rejects. We don't produce clothes and shoes and so on any great scale. Food, we don't produce the food. We have the capacity to do it, but we don't. Even now, what you find happening, and this is a strictly hand-me-down from the days of slavery and colonialism. They want to start new industries. They were starting a shrimp industry in one of the islands. Who do you think they gave the chance to do it? I have nothing against people setting up businesses, and because of their ethnic background, I'm against them. They have Koreans in the island running, controlling the industry. Now, when you look at them in the islands, like I do, they don't hire outside people. They have their own people that are there controlling the business. They don't invest their money in the banks there. Their money is invested in their own banks away. They might give a little scholarship, or they might give some money for some little function, or a carnival queen. At this time of carnival, they give a little $500 or a little trip on American Airlines to come here, to go to Brooklyn to see their aunt and to go down and get cosmetics and things that don't suit their face. And this is the kind of thing that they do. That's not good enough. The money goes out the same way the money would go out of the Caribbean to the banks of to the Bank of England, to those places during the time of slavery. It's the same way the money is going to the Royal Bank of Canada, is going to Westminster Bank, is going to Citibank, and it's going all investments. Let me give you another instance that's straight out of the slave thing. There's a woman in one of the islands who controls the flower industry. That island produces beautiful flowers. You don't even have to, you just go into certain areas in the mountains and the valleys, and they produce lilies and other things that are beautiful. She came there, she retired as a teacher from Boston after having worked as a teacher in Boston for 40 years. She is European stock. She comes to the island on a visit, and then she loves the island, and she decides she's going to stay there. They give her all the necessary papers, so she stays there. She's there now. She's a citizen now. And she sees this flower thing. She begins to get into the flower business. And do you know, she controls the flower industry there. I have nothing against the person. What I'm saying, that the government 10 years ago had a chance of letting a few locals who wanted to do that. They didn't allow it. They allowed this woman to do that. Now, she is a rich woman. She told me herself, I talked to her. She said, you know, Ed, if I had known that this was like that, I had wasted 40 years teaching in Boston. I would have been a billionaire today if I had come here when I was young. That's the kind of thing that is happening still. All these things, again, they come out of the sort of the slave, the kind of mentality, dependency that we have from a slave condition where we depend on food, and the plantation owner would clothe, feed, and do everything to the slave. And this is the same thing, that kind of thing that operates. So what I'm saying is that it operated in Africa. You would be surprised. Again, I do not like to say these things to be divisive. I'm just saying, facing the truth. You do not know how deeply colonialism, depending on which country it is from Europe, has entered into the African, on the motherland of Africa. You would be surprised. And in the Caribbean, it's the same thing. Today, there's still a kind of love-hate relationship between colonizer and colonized. We are still, in a great sense, economically colonized. When we're talking about improving the economy of the Caribbean or the economy of Africa, we're looking outside of Africa. And when we look at outside of Africa, outside of Ghana, outside of Senegal, we're not looking at African Americans, you know. We're looking at Wall Street. That's what they're looking at. African leaders come here. They talk one kind of language uptown, past 96th Street, coming up to Harlem. When they hit Wall Street, it's a totally different language that they're talking. The language of money is what they're all about. They don't come up here on 125th Street to talk that to African brothers who are here. That kind of, it is not that there's any hatred or dislike, but it's just that the colonial dependency is still there. That is where it's at. And it is, as Africans themselves, whether we are Africans in the diaspora in the Caribbean or in New York or in Georgia, but we allowed that to happen. We allowed it to happen. And we still look to them. That is why when I hear people saying that, the amount of money that we spend every year is 450 billion, Black African American people. That's a staggering figure. It's a figure that's higher than most of the countries, even some countries in Europe, and as for countries that are in the Caribbean and Africa. That money, what's happening to it? to give us a base. We don't need a base. We don't need a consumer base. We're just going to be left alone if we're only consumers. We've got to control this thing. And that is one of the things that slavery destroyed, colonialism destroyed. Amos said it in his book talking about his native land. He says, whenever colonialism exists, the indigenous root culture is in the process of being suffocated or strangled. When that happens, the person to whom it happens ceases to be what he or she was and becomes a carbon copy of something that does not suit him and is not geared to help him. In other words, he loses the mind that he should have. He's segregated his African mind and he's put a colonial mind there. And these two cannot exist together. It's either one or the other. And unfortunately, he was right. And we're still in that process. Frantz Fanon says the same thing. When he's talking about revolution and change, he's talking about the same thing. He says it is left to each generation has a duty to fulfill. He's talking about Africans in the vast sense, in the diasporic sense. Each generation has something to do. And that something is not to imitate Europe and her institutions, but to create, to invent something that comes out of his own roots. And that is his duty. If he cannot fulfill it, then he is an enemy in the struggle. This is plain as day. It is true. Because it is no use how much success I have, or you have, or we have individually. We have a lot of success. We have a lot of brilliant people among our people from all levels. But it doesn't mean a thing if that can be brought together to get a control in the corridors of power. We do not exist in the corridors of power except that we are hoovering the furs of the corridors of power. That is not good enough. People go, look at throughout the years that you've been watching, the United States goes to Africa on summit talks. It goes everywhere in the world of summit talks. How many times do you see a top African American who's born here who goes there in a capacity like a Secretary of State to give an indication and to give a direction about Africa? Never. We were talking the other day, about a few years ago, that people are saying, not in my lifetime, apartheid won't go in my lifetime. Apartheid has gone. It's true that where it's at the moment, there's a lot of work to be done. But at least, whether it's a paper man or what, but there's a paper leader of the African nation, South African nation today, if you want to call Mandela that. But at least they have to do business with him in the White House or in the State Department. We have African ambassadors. They don't listen to them. African ambassadors from here and from there. It is too long this has been happening. These are the things we need to look about, especially when we're talking about our economy. And whether people like to hear it or not, the state that we are in now is a distinct state that came out of the slave experience. You can say whatever you want. The slave experience was an experience of dependency. Today we have it to the fact. Even in ordinary things, look, every year in the month of June, every time a person picks up his newspaper on the morning of June the 10th in the Caribbean or in Africa, you know what he's looking for? To see if he's on the Queen's Honours List from Britain, and he's made a knight, or he's made an MB, a member of the British Empire. The British Empire doesn't even exist. They're waiting for this thing from the Queen. You have an MB or a GB, it doesn't mean you're a thing. The British Empire is something for Britain. It's no longer there. But they look up to that. They don't look up to themselves of what honors their country and their people can give them. They're looking at honors from the royalty. And royalty to this moment is not in a happy shape at the moment now, as you probably know. Read the papers and watch the television. You know that. These are the things we're still stuck up. Emulation. Following the patterns of others. A Frenchman once said, a French historian of the 18th century, he was talking at a convention in Paris, and he said, the Caribbean was created by the metropole. In other words, the countries, the big European countries of the world and so on. It was created by the metropole for the metropole. For the metropole. Do you need to hear any more? Still today, the goods we are trying to sell, our leaders, our political leaders, our chiefs of government, our prime ministers and our ministers go to Europe, they come down here, and they're asking to borrow money. I'm not saying you're coming for, like in the hurricane that hit the islands the other day. A lot of them came up asking for money. But that should not be the end of it at all. They should be able to be in a position to produce, the people themselves to generate this question of self-help. Garvey was on about self-help. When Garvey built Garvey was not on a back to Africa. Garvey was on this thing. He built factories. He had all sorts of things. He had shipping lines. Garvey had everything. He said self-help is the most important thing. And we must learn to have that self-help for ourselves. Carlos Cook and all the others have been saying that. And up to now, we just say it. The action is not there to follow it up. And again, that comes from the dependency of slavery. When people come from the Caribbean, governments come here, they go to Europe, they go to Canada, they go everywhere. You know what I know, because I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Britain, so I know. They said, oh, there comes, in the BBC, they say, oh, there comes the Beggar's Opera again. There comes the Beggar's Opera. They're coming, their prime ministers, to beg for money. But what I'm saying is that we don't look to ourselves to do that. I can give you an instance that that hits me every year. Every year in the world, two things happen where Caribbean or black people are. You have Carnival in the Caribbean every year, and another thing you must expect every year is hurricanes in the Caribbean. You can link the two and make one, while one causes destruction and death, the other one can be there to help out. Look at Labor Day on Eastern Parkway. We talk about, you see what it had, the Million Men March, how much money it could produce. The Carnival on Eastern Parkway can do the same. They say that there were 2 million people. Can you imagine just talking to them about help for the hurricane? They'll pass baskets around. $1 from 2 million people on Eastern Parkway. $1. Well, you can't do anything with $1. In fact, nowadays, if you give a homeless man $1, he look at you and say, you need it more than I do. $1 can't buy you a roti. $1 can't take you on the train out of your home to come back. If you have $1, you have to walk. What can $1 buy? $1. Can you imagine what 2 million or close on $2 million would do if it was controlled properly to help build what the hurricane destroyed in the Caribbean? That would be that kind of money to help in the building of the Caribbean. And not only that, we do it every year. There are carnivals in Canada, carnivals even in Austria today. There are carnivals everywhere, in France, in England, in Boston, everywhere there's a carnival going on. Every LIB, you notice that there are carnivals everywhere. What's wrong with giving scholarships or giving help or helping with homes or helping with homes for people, hospitals? What's wrong with that? Modern equipment for hospitals. What's wrong with that? Scholarships for young people, not only here in this country, but in the Caribbean. Why not this vast link? Why not? We're going to have a great big time on, I'm not saying you shouldn't have a good time on Eastern Parkway, but let's put it to something useful and something concrete. We separate culture from economics. The two are not separated. Politics, economics, and culture are all linked together, forming the civilization that we belong to. When we get that in our heads, then we'll be able to do something. But until then, we'll only be talking about it, the unity. Unity means putting your hand in pocket as a group of people and spending so much money to build something that is yours. The same thing, I see the papers, I'm not blaming them, they're making a big fuss about the new scheme of $330 million came into Harlem on this new scheme that they have there. Rangel wrote it in, Yes, it's good to get that from the government, but what about self-help that Garvey was talking about, and he did? What about that? What about it? We don't have, this is necessary. This is the thing, that is how we can turn the tables from the kind of slave condition to a condition where we control our own destiny. The only way you can control your destiny is when you have the power and the money to do it. That's the way. It is necessary to do it. Because money can help in many ways, particularly we're talking about our youth and educating our youth and helping them. We're not talking about what they are talking about, building prisons to put our youth. That's the kind of future we can see that is positive. They have made an attempt, even the government has made an attempt to build more and more prisons. And more prisons are not supposed to stay empty. And they're not going to have predominantly Anglo-Saxon people in them. The people that they want to put in those prisons. Let us do something to stop it or to check the tide, to check the flow of this kind of thing. Because it's no use having children and saying, I want my child to be a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever, and then we do nothing about it. We don't even bother about their education. That is something that the slave condition did to us. And it's something that we have to completely put out of our minds and take. The new millennium must make us, for instance, remember the words of Du Bois about the color line and say there's not going to be any color line. There's going to be an African line where our people are going to meet on level ground. The playing field is going to be leveled, and we are going to make our playing field leveled for ourselves because we've been ignored for too long, and we're going to be ignored for another 100 years or 1,000 years in the next century. We're going to be ignored if we carry on like we've been carrying on so far, and that cannot be allowed to happen. Yeah.
Angela, are you tired? You need a break?
No, I can go on, since the steam is in me here.
I know Angela wants to bounce.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah. I'd like us to go into the beginnings of this dependent mentality of the slave, tracing the journey of our enslaved ancestors across the Middle Passage, their landing on the shores of this new world, and then being taken to this plantation and the experiences that they had to undergo from the seasoning process on, and how they were conditioned to fit into the society. For instance, I've read accounts of how after someone has landed, a slave has landed, and he's taken to the auction block, that basically how they were treated, they had to undergo an examination. Their mouths were opened and their teeth were examined to see if they were healthy. Even at certain times, their saliva was tasted. It was like they were licked by someone to taste how healthy the saliva was, so they could find out how healthy the slave was. So we're starting with a process of total humiliation.
Yeah.
And how now we have this very dependent mentality. So I'd like us to go through our history on that level.
What you say is exactly what happened, and sometimes worse. For instance, if you read the book of Oladawa Equiano, a book that an African, an Ibu, wrote in 1789, and it was published in England, and it was called The Interesting Narrative of the African, Oladawa Equiano, written by himself. And he was talking about what happened to him when he was captured as a boy of 10 years. He and his daughter were captured outside a little village where they lived in Benin. a place called Esaka, and he screamed and they burnt the village, and they took him and his sister to the coast. But his sister went one way and he went the other, and he never saw his sister again. But he describes what happened to him when he got on the ship. He wouldn't eat, and to force him to eat, they had all sorts of implements of quote unquote punishment, but they were really instruments of torture, sold in shops in New Boston, in New York, and so on in those days. And they would put this thing in his mouth and open the mouth. It would be inside his mouth, and they just did that, so your mouth had to open. Otherwise, they'd split it in two. They had this two thing they'd pull, and then your mouth is open. And when his mouth was opened, they would pour the food down in his mouth. And that is to make him, he wouldn't eat. And that's how they forced him to take victuals, as they call it, at that time. He refused to eat. And they would go through these kind of measures at the time. When you got on the plantation, for instance, when you got to the auction block, you went through the most utter humiliation. The humiliation of being, women had a half a thing on them and nothing else. And they were literally, the auctioneer would be saying the most repulsive things while he was touching and feeling, and this young 15-year-old girl, and he would be showing how you should have her because she's going to be a good handmaiden, and at the same time you can use her for whatever purpose you want. And he would say, look at how strong, look at her thighs, and he would slap her thighs, and all this thing was going on. And people would come, some people who didn't want to buy any African slaves, they would come there just to witness this, like you're going to a football game, and they'd come there to witness this thing, to see the spectacle. It was like a ball game you were going to, or a boxing match or something. And they would come on the docks to see, or it would take place on the docks, and they would sell this thing. Like, for instance, they once had a girl that they sold, and she was such a fine, as the auctioneer said, a fine physical specimen of a woman, that when they auctioned her, she fetched $1,475. At that time, we're talking about 1810. Can you imagine how much money that meant at the time? $1,475. And you know who bought her? A priest. An Anglican, a Church of England priest. He says he's going to convert and make a good Christian of her. And you know what he meant by he was making a good Christian of her. But this would happen all the time. But if you read slave reports from slaves themselves who managed to give their reports later on, those who escaped this thing, they were always angry. There was no slave, they tell you. I was reading Esteban's story about he was an escaped slave in Cuba. And he said there was no slave, no matter how much he pretended to be a fool and accept what his master did, enjoyed the condition of slavery. What he did, in other words, what he was saying is that even Uncle Toms would pretend, but it wasn't true. Because they hated, everyone hated the condition. And the thing about it too, I want to talk here. From the time that Africans were left the slave forts, wherever it was, in the fort the Christian, or any of those forts, and they got on the ship, and the high tide, and the ship was leaving the Bight of Benin. From the time the boat, there was howling and screaming and shouting when they saw through the hole, they would peep and see the shores of Africa disappearing. And that was the most dangerous time, because if they had them on the top deck, many of them, as you know the story, would jump alive to go back to Africa, because they felt that their spirit would go back. Up to in the Caribbean, I know up to my years, I know many, many elderly people who think when you're burying them, they insist, one of the things the people I know insist in being buried with their feet towards Africa. I can remember telling a woman, my Edward, I said, well, how you know? When I was telling her, she was 98 years at the time. She is insisting that she wants to be buried with her feet towards. She says, because I'm going back to Africa. I said, well, how you know where Africa? She used to tell me, boy, don't ask me where Africa is. I know where Africa is. And she would point from the village, the sea. She lived on the sea coast. And where she was pointing was correct, you know. When you're looking at the compass, I say, yeah. I said, my Edward, you're right. That is, Africa is right. And she said, don't tell me. I can smell when the breeze that is coming here is not coming from the islands. I can smell when it's coming from the Sahara. She could smell the difference. She could tell the difference in the breezes. And it's true. I thought she was just joking. The other day I was going down on a plane to Dominica. And when we hit Tortola and we were going down, I noticed the sky was looking sort of foggy. And so I said, this looks funny. And the ship, the pilot got out and said, all this sort of the haze you're seeing there, this is the dust from the Sahara Desert that is blowing. Yeah, I said, heck, right in the Caribbean, African, you know, things are falling down on the sea and falling on the land. So in a sense, we're really not too far away so I knew what the elderly people were saying. But going back to this thing, the most dangerous Africans for their freedom coming across the Middle Passage, you know who they were? Women. Women. They were the ones that challenged the crew at the time. They were the most dangerous ones. You know what they would do? Many of the sailors that they were put to guard them and so on, for disease and so on, they would give the sailors to drink rum. Rum was the thing was supposed to keep away and in those days there were no injections and so on. So they would want to keep out the flux and keep out this. So they would drink. So some of the sailors would imbibe a little too much. And by the time the captain was in his cabin, and that was what they would do, they would go down and try to get some of the African women together and a few of the sailors and bring them to the top where they were to do you know what. So they were full of rum. Some of the women, the young women, allowed them to do that. And when they got up into wherever the deck where they were hiding, then they would take the sailor's own knife and kill them and take the keys away from them and unlock themselves and unlock, and there would be a whole to-do going on, and they would dash at the other sailors there and chop them. And these riots happened a lot. It's only the other day a book was written by a sister from the Caribbean. She teaches in the Caribbean, where this was exposed. African women were the one that led, and on the plantations too. In Barbados and the plantation, they said women were docile. They were not. They had to face two things. They had to face the hard work that their men were doing, and they had to face the viciousness and sexy things of these men, you know, of the plantation owners and their sons and their daughters, because it is a known thing. It was written by Falconbridge, who was a doctor, who went to the Caribbean at that time as a doctor, Alexander Falconbridge. And he said that 1 out of every 20 Europeans that went down to the Caribbean on plantations, 19 would have African mistresses, whether they were married or single. The only one that would not have an African mistress was usually a Quaker. And after he had been there, because he was a Quaker and he wanted to keep to his religion, but after he was there 3 weeks or 6 weeks, he would begin to change. And he would succumb to this thing. And he himself would have a young African mistress, because one of the things they gave these young Europeans when they came there, have your pick of one. Have your pick of one of the ladies. Have your pick of one of the slave women. They brought them there for that purpose. And there are some of them who even brought, unfortunately, it's in the book of some of the writers, they even brought young boys for those who had funny habits, for those Europeans who had funny habits. And they did have funny habits too. If you read the story of this thing, written by one of their own men, you would, I have it somewhere there, I didn't bring it out, but it would turn you'd make you cringe when you read what they were doing to, even their own writers said that they practiced the most terrible sexual vices and things on these poor young innocent African women, girls and so on, and change them. And some of these women succumbed, some, but and they did it for a purpose. And this is the kind of life that went on the plantation. In Barbados, I wish I had brought that book. It was published only the other day, and it's a new book written by a sister. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that they would give some young women, as many women worked on the plantation on the fields as men. Now they would give young African women that they were after, the young men, the sons and even the plantation owners themselves, they would put them to work certain patches of land, whether they were planting they were planting dashins or tanyas or yams, or they were cutting the stalks of cane plants. They would put them very far away, where they were almost hidden. And these young men, the sons or the foremen, would ride their horses to where these young women were, and there they would pick one. They would want to molest them there and then, and have sexual relations there. There was one girl, they were always after her. I can't remember the name, but she was she was aware of her attractiveness, and she utilized it as a weapon against them. And one of the man the driver of one of the gangs was after her, and he was a mean sort of man. And he was after her one morning and came to her and told her, "Come here." He says, "Come here." He got off his horse and he stood near his horse under a big hidden thing of trees and told her to come here. She said, "No, you come to me." And she said, "How dare you?" She said, "You come to me." So he said, "All right," and he came to her. And when he came near her, with one swipe, she chopped his head off. And her other friends knew that this was going to happen, because, there was a sort of, telegraph, all of us knew what was happening. And the others ran to her and took her and saved, and they all escaped from the plantation. But that used to happen a lot. They never wrote about that, those kind of things, until the evidence is there. It was the same thing with all the revolutions and the riots that took place. They kept that hidden. They wanted to say that Africans were the ones who were abolitionists, got them out of slavery. They didn't do anything of the sort. The abolitionists only changed laws that they themselves their people had passed. The Africans who were enslaved all got away by themselves. When they couldn't control, the slave condition was faltering, was breaking down. When they couldn't control that anymore, that is when they began to say they were emancipating slaves. When they were forced to do it through these revolutions, not only Haiti, Jamaica, Dominica, all those, even the night before abolition, the last slave revolt in Barbados was the night before. That was in 1833, just before, a day before the abolitionist papers came through. They didn't even know that, and they fought. That was the last big revolution and riot they had. In Barbados, it's supposed to be such a placid place. That's what happened. Every single island, everyone, and in the mainland countries like Brazil and so on, that was happening. That's what made the slave condition crumble. In Jamaica, was the same thing. 9 months before emancipation, one of the biggest revolts was fought in December the 17th, 1832, in Jamaica. And they burned down 136 plantations and killed thousands of them. That's what forced these people to give. They didn't love any slaves. They didn't love those people. They were forced to do it. And the Africans that were on the Caribbean, they were the ones they tried to break in. But it was the most difficult thing to break in the people that were there, because they were that way inclined. It shows you through all the riots, and there were revolution in Jamaica alone. There was over 250. There were riots and revolutions all the time for 35 years, Kojo fought them, and they fought them all the time. They were fighting them. In Dominica, it was the same thing. You don't hear those things because, I brought out some of them in my book. But you don't hear a lot about that because you're not going to expect Europeans to write about things that are successful by slavery. They don't do it. They don't do it at all. So what I'm saying is that the breaking of some of them, they would break them, and they would those that they fell in, they would send them to New Orleans, to some from Haiti, to Congo Square, and they would send them in New Orleans. But when they came to New Orleans, wherever they went, they spread this thing of revolution. What do you think, Gabriel Prost and the others, what do you think encouraged them a lot? They all spoke about it in their Gabriel Prost, Denmark BC, the Haitian Revolution. They were afraid of Haiti. Europeans here, Americans, Anglo-Americans were mortally afraid in New York, here, everywhere, about Haiti. What happened? What happened with Desalegn, and what happened with Christophe and Pétion and all of these people? They were mortally afraid of it, that it was going to happen here. And that's what hastened on the abolition, because Africans never took kindly to slavery. They never did. No matter, all of us have different approaches to life. Some of them would be more outspoken than others. Others would keep it to themselves. But deep down, let's take Tubman. When they asked Harriet Tubman to describe what slavery was, you know what she said? Slavery is the next thing to hell. I know, because I was a slave for 25 years of my life. The next thing to hell, she said. And she made up her mind that she was going to break away from that. And she did. She not only broke away, she came back many times and brought people back to their freedom and liberty. That's what it did with people. Alex Guma, who was a slave who was brought to be executed before a court, he said, why make a mockery? The same kind of thing that this man said, his Walker's appeal. The same thing he said, why make a mockery of taking me? You want to kill me. He says, but with a slave, when a slave, an African slave, kills his master, he does an act of justice when he kills his master. Justice to himself and his people. And he said that in court. When he kills his master, he does an act of justice to himself and his people. That's what he said. They were not afraid to die. This is the kind of amazing thing. I mean, young women could fight. Young women could fight these people, fight these men, fight them, literally fight them. And the thing is the women would gang up together. That was another thing. Sisters would gang up together, and they were not afraid to face these people. They were not, even as they say, on board ship. They were already fighting this thing on board ship. They knew the circumstances, they knew what would happen, but yet they would fight it. This is a tremendous epic that we saw only bits and pieces of this thing in Sankofa and the other thing, but we haven't seen the full story of the great fight there was in this hemisphere against the slave condition. It's nothing to be ashamed of. As Kenneth Stamp said in his book, The Peculiar Institution, talking about slavery in the antebellum South, he said, the Negro has nothing to be, he's a white scholar, so at least he's an honest one. He said, the Negro has nothing to be ashamed of in slavery. Those who should be ashamed is the South and the plant, the slave owner. These are the ones that have to be ashamed. The Negro has nothing to be ashamed of. It is they who have things to be ashamed of. And it's true. I have always said that. I have nothing to be ashamed of. We have nothing to be ashamed of. They have the shame. But you see, they have it to such a terrible degree that they like to put all their nasty things on us. And we have all the vices. They talk about men, about jails and so on. They will never tell you the hundreds and thousands that were sent here from jails in Britain not black people, white people, sent to jails to Australia, everywhere they were sent. And they were the ones committing the most atrocious crimes that you can believe. And it doesn't surprise me. Seeing how the Klan and others behave has never surprised me, because I know there's a historical background for all of that. And we are not the ones responsible. They are responsible. They're all right to say it, but they will never produce. Can you imagine a European, an Anglo-American professor standing before a class mainly of Hispanic people and black people and saying those things about it? He can't do it. He can't do it. With all conscious to himself, he won't do it. He will try to put the blame on. That's what they're making it appear to the world, that it is African peoples that are creating all the things. It isn't. Crime is still a very white disease, and not a black one. But you know what? You see the way they've gone about it. Dishonesty. One of the things that I've always remembered is something that Justice Leon Higginbotham wrote in his book, In a Matter of Color. And he's talking about what the judicial system in America did to blacks. I like to quote him, but and his book is somewhere up there, you know. And I like to quote him in The Matter of Color. And what he says, you know, what it has done to millions and millions of black people who have suffered under the judicial system. They are still suffering under the judicial system. They're still suffering more than ever today. If you read Bruce Wright, is a great scholar, if you read his book, you'll see the same thing. The judicial system is geared against. I was seen against this. I was reading, yes, today I bought a paper. I was downtown when I was coming up, to show you how it hasn't changed. I bought this Express paper. It's the Beaverbrook paper from England. I bought it because I saw that, yes, that's in England. Police admit, yes, we do pick on the blacks. Look at it there.
Yeah.
Yes, we do pick on the blacks. The same thing they do here. It's the same thing they do in England and everywhere else. In Paris, it's the same thing. This racism is endemic all over Europe today, more than anything else is happening. And yes,
I'd like to ask about how we've internalized that racism. Okay, this question of color, and going back again to this question of color and going back again to the slave plantation. You know, with all the sexual contact between the slave masters and the slave women, basically the raping of the women, was created within the slave system a class of mulattoes, or it's not just mulattoes. They had many gradations of color.
Right.
And I want to talk about how those different gradations of color within the plantation affected the psyche of the slave, and how that was used in ways to divide the slave plantation.
You're right, it was used a lot. They used laws, they used social patterns of behavior, all these things to divide blacks and people of different shades of color. It's very noticeable in Hispanic countries, even today. It's very noticeable in the Caribbean, not as much as it was before, but it's there. And the question of one of the biggest problems of Haiti, particularly, that's the one that comes to mind, but it has been a problem with Africans in the diaspora, whether they're here in New Orleans, in New York, or in the Trinidad or wherever, but it has been there. This question of shades of color, complexion, has always played. On the plantation in the Caribbean, one of the things the plantation owner said, if a plantation owner had an affair with an African woman, and she had a child, and that child was obviously a mulatto, the child would be lighter than the mother, 10 to 1. It's going to be lighter than the mother in color. The mother may have had a boyfriend, an African boyfriend on the plantation, Jack or whatever his name, and she may have had a child, by this African boyfriend. And the child would be kind of darkish color, like mother and like father. She would have this mulatto child. This mulatto child would be taken out of her control totally by the plantation owner. They passed laws themselves to say that being a mulatto, being of white and black heritage, that child could not stand the rigors and do the rough work in the field like his brother who was black. So they didn't allow mulattoes to do field work. They would give mulatto children jobs, like what? To spy or to keep their eyes on the different gangs and run back and tell the father. They would allow that child to sleep in the big house, perhaps downstairs in one of the basement rooms. They would allow that child to work there in the kitchen and so on, and to play with his quote-unquote white brothers. But his white brothers could kick him or do anything to him, and he couldn't retaliate. He would be given food, not at the table, but when they were finished eating, he would sit in the pantry or in the kitchen, and he would eat from one of the plates. He'd eat food, he'd get food there. If the child loved his mother, he would take some food, pack it up in the thing, and bring it to his mother or his brothers in the cabins where they lived. Now that child had those privileges. Many of them, when they grew up, they were educated by their fathers. For instance, a father, a plantation owner, may not have had children with his wife, and that would be the only son he had. And that boy, perhaps, would be a clever boy who understood the plantation and they allowed that child to get an education. Blacks children were not educated, but they would allow him to get a certain education. And depending on how good he was, they would send him to England, or they would send the daughter to England. They would send him to France, and they would give him a hat. Many of the mulattoes in Haiti had been educated in France. People like Vincent Auger, he was the son of a rich aristocrat, a duke. He was his final education in Paris, and he was a scholar. He came back, and he felt humiliated because they wouldn't allow him, for instance, he joined the army, and they wouldn't allow him to reach you couldn't be more than a captain in the army, whether you were brilliant or not. You couldn't reach major or lieutenant colonel or general, because he was a mulatto. And yet he would have a brother who was white, who was for his father and mother, and yet that brother could reach the highest. And they couldn't sit in certain seats in the seats at the front of the church and so on. You'd have to sit in the middle or at the back. And the theater was the same thing, and the show. So they were treated in that fashion, even by the poor whites and the lesser whites, the ordinary shopkeepers and so on that were on the island at the time. And they resented it. And they fought their fathers about this. And at the same time, they always felt that they were superior to the blacks in Haiti. And that was a bone of, and this is what that destroyed Haiti. Not the fact they had won the war, but they lost the battle against themselves. There were very few Haitian mulattoes that really took sides. They used the blacks, they used their parents, they used their brothers, and when it came down to the final thing, they would betray them. They would betray them. And this is one of the things. They themselves, 12 of the richest plantations after their fathers died were owned by mulattoes. And they had slaves. They had, for instance, some of them had their own brothers working as heading the gangs and so on. But they had slaves. They were rich. And what they would do, they would go to France, go to Paris, marry a Parisian woman. And lots of the families they have there now, up to now, the descendants, that some of them that claim to be white, they come out of this kind of thing. And I know Haitians who scholars and friends of whom I know, I have some Haitian friends who tell me, this business will never change, because mulattoes are prejudiced. They tell you préjugé. They're always telling you this kind of thing. I know what they mean by that because I speak Creole, so I understand. I know a person. She's a fine person. She's dark, but she happens to have very light children. She wouldn't want her daughters. She got two pretty daughters. She wouldn't want her daughters to marry a black Asian. She wouldn't. And I mean, it is this kind of thing that still pervades in the society. There is no link between the two, because after the revolution, when Dessalines died and when Christophe died, there was a whole slew of Haitian presidents that were mulattoes. And they all joined forces with France. And France began to export things to Haiti. They began to have, they were calling Haiti at the time the Paris of the Antilles. The Paris of the Antilles. Many of their people, they would send their children to school. They wanted their daughters. I know, for instance, I used to play football against the island. I was an island footballer, I was on my place. And I used to play against Martinique, and I had some Martinican friends who were mulattoes, one particularly family. That is a light-skinned family. But boy, they were prejudiced.